Hello and welcome to CIO News. I am Khushbu, Soni, your host for broadcast and the chief editor at CIO News. This is an exclusive interview series on the topic of cybersecurity in the rapidly changing times. It is a recorded session and will be available on our website, that is cionews.co.in, and our CIO News LinkedIn handle. It gives me an immense pleasure in introducing our guest for today. He's Akshay Garkel, partner at Thornton, Bharat LLP. Akshay is a business leader with more than 20 years of experience in IT, security, and cybersecurity, spanning across various geographies, including India, APAC, and Middle East. His area of work expertise range across the relevant blend of cybersecurity, business, and practice management. Akshay's focus has been working with large financial institutes, including public and private sector banks, mutual fund houses, large exchanges, insurance companies, and capital houses in India. Akshay, it's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Khushbu. It's likewise, and it's an honor to be here on your channel. Thank you.
Awesome. I am also accompanied by Alain Sanchez. He is the Chief Information Security Officer, EMEA at Fortinet. Alain is one of the prominent members of the C-suite community. His scope of responsibility grew from being a guardian of data to enablers of ambition transformations. Alain is an expertise in multi-cloud, OT, artificial intelligence, 5G, collaboration, and also he's fundamentally changing the way individuals and organizations live, learn, and decide. Alain has potentially carried next generation of breaches systematically exploited by dark and smart organizations. Alain, an absolute pleasure to have you again.
Thank you, Khushbu, and thank you, Akshay. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion today.
Awesome. So I would like to start with the first question. Akshay, if you can, talk about while we are in this whole unprecedented challenges that we've been facing for almost 2 years now, how has pandemic affected the way you think about cybersecurity, and how are you reassessing the security strategy?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I think it's a brilliant question to begin with. As some of the industry leaders have been quoting, as they say, geography is history, right? And essentially earlier we hit into the pandemic, and obviously there was a different way of working. We called it as the new normal. And now essentially while we've essentially moved out of the new normal and we've hit a certain degree of steady state, we are calling it essentially, the different way of operating within businesses. Now, when you look at the new normal, we've got organizations who essentially started connecting remotely, organizations who had their entire workforce management connect from their respective homes. We also had organizations adopt a fair bit of cloud in terms of, increased cloud adoption. Because it was important to get information anywhere, anytime. And from that perspective, again, it became, very important to kind of, look at different avenues. Now, of course, there were certain challenges which also came with this paradigm shift. And those challenges were like, as we say that my security is as strong as my weakest chain. So from that perspective, the endpoints essentially became the weakest chain here in the entire ecosystem of business. So it was important to make sure that there is adequate amount of security embedded within the endpoints, adequate amount of role-based access embedded for the security perspective for the power users who carry a lot of critical information and yet are connecting from home, and a secure channel of access essentially from home or any remote location to the organization, either via the cloud or directly to the organization.
Awesome. Alain, from your perspective, how should CIOs look at reassessing the security strategy? We'd love to hear your thoughts as well on this.
I think they have to have a holistic approach of cybersecurity. The days are gone where you could pick up a point solution for a given area of cybersecurity. Say you would go after antivirus, you would put in place a super authentication, you would have a sandbox technology, and you would leave to someone else later to do the integration. We just don't have the time for that. The threat has changed in sophistication and in magnitude. And it's full, what we call a security fabric, which is a combined set of integrated, automated solutions that enable a broad visibility of the various components of the network and the security and the threat in an environment that is not getting any simpler. The technologies are faster. Take 5G, for instance, take the new advanced access technologies for OT. It's by unit of seconds, the density of information that come in and out your network that you have to deal with. So if you just look backwards a little bit, last spring and summer, you can see that ransomware, for instance, which is still the biggest threat that in volume we have to deal with, has switched from broad attacks to company-targeted attacks, very granular, very related to the company itself. And cybercrime is now covering all phases of the kill chain. And that includes reconnaissance, which is before you trigger the attack, you send some kind of a dark soldiers to check out the vulnerabilities, and then we weaponize these vulnerabilities in a very structured way. So, for instance, Hafnium, which was building blocks coming from a former attack that was called 0 Day, that was targeting Microsoft exchanges in some targeted company. This is come back in January. SolarWinds in March, which was using the capability of upgrading some pieces of software. And in order to do that, you have to have some sort of elevated credentials, a little bit like an admin credential. And that was exploiting this authentication service vulnerability. And we could go on and on. In June, we had Revel that was targeting Kaseya VSA platforms. So you see that the threat is organized. The threat is a business. And on the other end, the infrastructure is becoming more complex. The fact that it becomes more complex has some great business benefits, but it also increases what we call the attack surface. So that is the framework in which I see the coming months and years calling for a holistic approach of cybersecurity and get rid of what we used to call, we used to call the best of breed, old school procurement attitude.
Very true, very true. My following question on that is, one of the major challenges that were faced was, securing the work from home environment and also managing the endpoint protection. What were the best practices, that can be followed for the entire securing work from home environment? So maybe we can start with Akshay, and then Alain, you can also add up to that.
Right. I think it's a very simple but very, very impactful question that you asked. And I believe that, in today's time, it is very important. And, just to basically pick up a strain from where Alain left on the ransomwares, the trend that we've seen in terms of an upward trend on the ransomware. And I'm trying to get to the answer of your question, Khushbu, is that, we've seen a lateral movement actually start from the endpoints. And while we've seen even in the country, we've seen the increase of the cyber attacks. Essentially, the nature of the attack is not like the attack comes in and then explodes the next day. It basically does a lateral movement through the weakest chain, laptops or endpoints in this case, goes into the environment, and then essentially sits there to kind of collect as much as possible in terms of the information, especially the personal identifiable information, the contract information, where there is a legal contract, there are some confidential and restricted information, and so on and so forth, which it tries to collect and then tries to port out. In today's time, there have been solutions which are available which can actually pick up the trend when such kind of files essentially getting executed. And hence today's ransomwares are becoming more and more sophisticated, where they do not come in with an executable. And they try to look for executables which are sitting in the environment for legitimate purposes. And then essentially they try to utilize them to kind of execute their programs. Now, having said that, what are some of the past historic trends that we have seen is that based on collection of the information for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, or even months together, when there is a potential amount of information that can be used to hold the organization to ransom, that is the time when they start arresting the servers. And once the encryption happens, then essentially a ransom demand in terms of a Bitcoin, etc., is made. Now, we've seen in the past, and we've personally investigated a lot of these cyber incidents where we have essentially seen that this lateral movement, is very typical, where there is a lot of information which has been collected over a period of time and then essentially ported out through various methods. Now, one of the simple method was, the phishing attacks, right? The stray links or some of the zero-touch attacks in today's time, which essentially have happened, and we've seen some of those examples, information passing through iMessages, etc., where the trend is moving towards organizations or people who really do not need to activate or action anything for the information to be ported out. All you need to do is to basically visit the site, or you need to do is to basically open certain application and automatically certain actions and behaviors are performed. Now, what are some of the best practices? Now, Khushbu, coming categorically to your question, what are some of the best practices? First and foremost, it is important to create a very strong awareness levels within the organization in terms of making sure that what you can whitelist and what you can't. Second is to basically, and I'll break it up into 3 broad areas: the people area, the process area, and the technology area. The second is basically where you have a fair bit of litmus test exercises or simulation exercises which are done to basically look at what is the readiness of the awareness posture within the organization, what is the readiness of the critical top management, power users like administrators, and so on and so forth, and of course the individual contributors. On the process side, it is very important to have a very, very strong incident response plan and a crisis management plan, a cyber crisis management plan. Now, when I talk about a cyber crisis management, it necessarily does not pertain to only looking at an incident and how do you react to it, but it's also about containment. It's also about minimizing the impact of a reoccurrence, right? And there are very strong playbooks essentially which are done today, where various exercises or various scenarios around crisis essentially are built. Now, I'll give you some simple examples of those crises. Right, for example, a simple spear phishing attack can actually bring down or do a brand reputation loss to the organization. Today, an organization which invests heavily into digital and has gone completely online, right? And imagine a simple thing like when you do a Google search for that organization and you get a search listing, there is a meta tag which is generated, and that meta tag says that this site is potentially unsafe to visit. Now, imagine what would be the brand reputation loss at that level, right? So from that perspective, have a continuous monitoring perspective of looking at these malwares, looking at what is really causing these issues, also looking at there's a potential issue in terms of bringing my brand down with respect to having any malicious content on the pages, to an extent of actually also looking at, these are fish sites, these are not the real sites, and so on and so forth, right? That's more on the technology. Of course, there are other technological factors like, two-factor authentication, simple hygiene on patching your systems on time, making sure that your role-based access is reviewed on a regular basis. You also basically look at, remote connectivity through encryption, VPNs, and all of those. Looking at some of the heuristic patterns like user behavior analysis and those kind of things, which will essentially also try to get some kind of a stream of what's happening on the ground. And at the same time, is there a behavior or a pattern which can be picked up, which can be categorized as a potential ransomware, for example, right? And then so I spoke about the technology, I spoke about the people. Now on the process, I think it is important to look at these plans, the SOPs, making sure that your board level organization is also, kind of following that plan. It is endorsed by the board. If I have a regulatory obligation, then essentially my plan is very well communicated to the regulators as well through my regular reporting based on what is expected, and so on and so forth, right? These are just some of the examples. Obviously, we can sit the entire day and talk about the best practices there, but yeah, just to give a view in terms of, what would be the best practices, that's the way I would respond.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Alain, if you could add on to this and your thoughts on Akshay's inputs.
Yeah, first to say that I completely agree with what Akshay just described as a way to address. I would perhaps add one dimension, which is you need to know where to start, because you have a large variety of areas where you could decide to deploy cybersecurity. You have the remote access workers, you have the diversity of the endpoints, both in terms of devices and people and sites. You have what we call the network edges, these remote sites, the edge routing network, all the architecture that enables these remote locations to be in business, to be connected to their business critical applications. You have the applications themselves, right? And at the same time, your company is submitted to regulations and compliance, is permanently under attack, and that accelerates its vulnerability. So the first thing you have when you want to put in place a best practice strategy is to understand where is the value created as a first dimension, and equally, where is the vulnerability? So you take all these dimensions that we talked about and assess the vulnerability. How long as, for instance, for the remote devices, the OS not been patched? Do we find in these machines some pieces of software that we don't want to find, that are outside the software inventory? Do we have ranges of IP addresses that are unprotected, or that get a level of authentication that is less than the rest of the company? And then analyze the way your company goes about creating value. In other words, what are the actual strategic assets involved in the value chain? And in order to do that properly, that second part, you have to engage a discussion with the operations, engage a discussion with the top level executives, with the marketing department, with the HR department, with the manufacturing department, if you have one, with the logistics department. And that gets you a very healthy exchange going on, by which not only you understand deeply how your company works, but you establish that link that is absolutely necessary when you will have to embark these people into the digital transformation, and associated to this digital transformation, the security transformation that you have to carry on. You would have discussed with these people, they would have understood what is at stake. And I come back to something that very important that Akshay said. It is about the education of the people. The moment you give them information about what is at stake, what are the typical attacks that potentially you might be in a situation to defend yourself from. And in order to understand these attacks, by the way, let me suggest that you go to a site that is called FortiGuard, where the latest bulletin of a team of specialists that scrutinize, people are passionate about understanding the attacks, locating the new ones, locating in the new ones the components that we saw before, and create sort of a health bulletin that you can use. And that health bulletin, you can tune by region, you can tune by country, you can have a granularity of what is the most probable attacks that you'll have to take care of. And all that landscape enables you to decide or to have options as regards to where you want to start. Now, when you have this option, go back to the stakeholders and have the choice made together on what is the investment, what is the risk mitigation in scenario one, and same thing for the other scenarios, so that everybody is involved in the choice. And then you start to speak a language which is not a language of technology, pure technology. Even if we love technology, some people in the company need to have a translation to assess the strategic importance of the investments that you're asking, or this new authentication process that, yes, is a little bit more demanding for the end user, but prevents you from something. So when you educate people, when you come back to them, they are with you, because there will be hiccups when you will deploy the next sophisticated defense mechanisms. It's not something that you switch on overnight. Anyone that tells you that has never been in the real gritty, nitty reality of the operations. But when this arrives, people feel it's part of their choice, their kind of cyber citizenship towards the company. And then that practice enables that digital transformation that is so necessary for the company, together with the security transformation that is necessary to be accepted, to be understood, and to be successfully deployed.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think wonderful insights. Great. My next follow-up question is around if you can measure to manage the supply chain risk. What are the practices to be followed for that? So, Akshay, maybe you start and then.
Sure. Thank you. And today, with as I said, the boundaries are getting grayer and grayer, and probably they will disappear one point in time. Supply chain also essentially has seen a paradigm shift, right? Today, if I just break down the supply chain into 2 or 3 broad areas, one is where we have essentially a downstream and then we have an upstream in a business. Downstream would be, and let's take an example of, say, a manufacturing organization, right? So the downstream would be more of the inventory management suppliers, looking at the third-party ecosystem with those suppliers and so on and so forth. Some of the third-party suppliers who would offer services for various perspectives. Then essentially we would have an upstream, which is a distribution channel, and the distribution channel essentially will have your third-party partners, distributors, and even end customers in some cases, right? So how do I actually measure that the risk associated to my supply chain is essentially being supported well? The number two visualization that I would request you to look at would be also that all of these processes, whether you talk about a payment process, you talk about inventory management process, you talk about a process on distribution channels, they are all supported through an application interface. Now the application interface is essentially gone to the next level of digital. The digital channels essentially are being now supported with a lot of advanced perspectives, now using various advanced solutions like IoT, blockchain, business intelligence, and then probably artificial intelligence, right? So how does an organization actually visualize all of these areas? How does the data flow? What is the various perspectives which are applied to the data? How does the organization actually build their data science as a DNA of the organization from a supply chain perspective? These are a lot of questions that keep coming across, and these are some of the questions that today industry is definitely, some of the most mature organizations are also asking these questions. Boards of organizations are asking that, how do you make sure that my supply chain is effective? It is on par, because there are a lot of questions around cost, questions around performance, questions around optimization, and also questions around turnaround times, right? Because today we are all living in a competitive world, and if you ask me, our travel time essentially has gone down. Our reach to customers has actually increased. All of that because the new normal, as we started this conversation with, is actually being accepted widely in the industry, right? So from that perspective, people don't expect you to be at their cabins or their cubicles, but their cabins and cubicles are essentially the computer screen, right? So that way productivity has gone up. So based on that, time to market is really important, and competition has only increased. So all of these questions are being asked. Now I'll come to focus on the security aspect, right? Khushbu, your question on security aspect. So if you look at supply chain as a topic, yes, there are some industry standards which essentially are being followed, and there are some of the authoritative industry standards. Say, for example, if you look at the CSCRM standards released by NIST, right, which is a cyber supply chain risk management process, they basically define 2 or 3 vectors. They define a risk management process in terms of how do you do the scorecarding, what are the and Alain touched about it in terms of the assets, right? So how do you identify the assets within a supply chain environment? How do you basically apply a rating and a ranking to it in terms of the criticality? How do you stitch it together with the data flow and run a data flow analysis to it? And then essentially, how do you identify what is critical in each of those processes from an information standpoint, and then apply the access controls in terms of who can access what and at what time, right? It's some of the tenets, right? May not cover the entire yard, but these are some of the tenets in the way. I'm just trying to give some perspective and give some direction in terms of a thought process here, right? Then, of course, once you build your baseline, build your framework, then essentially, how do you start maintaining, managing, and sustaining it, right? And that's very critical. So from that perspective, you look at the threat scenarios, right? Threat scenario is very important. Second is you look at the assurance scenarios, right? And I'll talk about each one of them. Then the third aspect that you look at is the integrity scenario, right? So when you look at the threat scenarios, predominantly, you look at the vulnerability postures, you look at the external adversaries or the external factors which actually influence and can actually compromise the posture from a threat perspective. You look at the third party ecosystem who have also the access, who are either the processor of information or essentially are handling a lot of critical information. So what is their posture in the overall? So extended enterprise is the key word here. So how do you deal with the extended enterprise, right? Then you also basically look into the other aspects from a secure supply chain perspective, is on the assurance side, right? How do I confirm that I have enough amount of assurance that there is a good amount of exception handling working. So when you talk about exception handling, you take a payment process and you look at process to pay, right? For example, as a process, do I have enough assurance that there is no compromise, there are no fraud risk associated with it, there is no compromise on the security perspective, are the transactions flowing the way they should flow? For example, you look at millions of transactions. I'm going a little nuts and bolts, but I just want to share the perspective. Millions of transactions, somebody is actually raised two invoices and shown an expense, but basically, at the end of one of the lines after a billion transactions, you also see a credit note against one of the invoices. But your calculation essentially is taken two invoices into consideration and taken it as a cost. That's a revenue leakage, right? So are we going at that level to basically look into the aspects of security, to the aspect of protecting the assets, which basically form an integral part of the entire supply chain ecosystem, right? I think that's the question that one needs to ask. Are the organizations looking at it from a complete yard perspective? And what I spoke about, the transaction reconciliation and the testing perspective, is on the assurance perspective, would cover both assurance and integrity checks. So I think both the aspects are very important here. Yeah, that would be my view on the secure side of the supply chain, if I was able to summarize it the way I'd like to do it.
Very well, absolutely. I think this was wonderful insights. Alain, to add up to this,
I would like to offer a direction of solution to the last question that Akshay just mentioned, is how are we going to go further into understanding I would say the return on investment on security investment itself, right? Because that is a question that when it comes to measurement, you measure the threat, you measure lots of things. You have a great news, by the way, when you talk about measurement, is a lot of the data that is necessary to have those KPIs, to have those measurements, are in the hands of the network and security teams. The information regarding the stream of data, who is connecting to what, the magnitude, the location, the type of service, as well as the very nature of the data that transits throughout the network. That is information that exists, and it's more and more of this information that is generated by all these devices. At some point, there is too much of this information, and you have to, exercise some choice about the parameters you want to store, etc. But let's come back to this return on investment. You have a very simple equation, but its implementation requires a layer of collaboration that I personally think is very useful. You can know the what I would call the annual loss expectancy, which is how much do I lose if this equipment gets damaged, if this production channel stops, if I lose this data, if my reputation is affected, if some personnel leave the company, how much do I lose? And you multiply that by the probability of this to occur. So the probability of an incident would be higher if you have a segment of unpatched machines, or the probability, the cost would be higher if your production chain stops for a day. You can measure that. And this information, again, the security team needs to seek it to the production teams, to the financial teams, to the marketing teams, to the HR teams. And again, you're starting to have, okay, this is the annual loss expectancy. How often can this happen? You multiply the first factor by the second, and you have the cost of the incident. If it happens 3 times a year and it's $500,000, then you are exposed to $1.5 million. Now, you subtract to that the cost of the solution that you envisage, the cost of the transformation of the security, the cost of hiring, the cost of equipping yourself, the cost of training. So you have two terms, a damage, a cost of the solution, and you divide that by the cost of solution. And that is your return on investment on the security investment that you are willing to do. And with that, you have a very good background, a very good foundation to talk to your CFO, to also talk to your end users, to talk to the various departments, and you start to change color. You're not only the technology guys that speaks bits and bytes and that always comes with a language that is difficult to understand. You have a businessman in front of you. That person talks about a return on investment. That person talks about various scenarios of investments associated to various scenarios of risk. And the entire company can decide about that. So I think perhaps, Akshay, if you think this addresses your question, I'd be delighted to walk you through this methodology to assess the return on investment of security, because that may help you decide, help you communicate, help you deploy some of the elements of your cybersecurity.
I think very beautifully put, Alain, and thank you so much for that. Crisp but yet a very entire yard perspective that you've given on return of security investment. And many organizations have started looking into the real meaning of return of security investment. It's not only about the revenue that you've helped the organization to generate, but it's also about how many incidents you averted, based on which the organization was able to achieve a good amount of resiliency into their business.
Exactly.
And I think that's very well summarized. Yeah.
Absolutely. And you see, the production people would call MTBF, mean time between failure. The brand department would think about reputation damage. They all come with their metrics, but at the end of the day, you can factor this in and you become the federative agent of this culture of risk and return on investment of the risk. And it's a very passionating direction of your career when you become that, because you're the catalyst of the next generation of cybersecurity within your company. And that's for your team. We always look for reasons to secure our experts, because we don't want them to go. They were so hard to recruit and to train and to put in this position. And bringing them this new dimension helps them. Their market value increases, the interest of their day increases. Now, you need to add to that, because you don't want to take them away from what they're doing just to do that. You have to add to that automation in your cybersecurity, so that some of the repetitive tasks, the human brain is very good at doing certain things, but also some others, when it's repetitive, you have a certain type of fatigue and demotivation. Now, if you install automation in some of the tasks, and we have beautiful ways of doing that, you create trees of decisions. It's a graphical interface. If this happens, then automatically does that. In this condition is met, but with this exception, then you do a different thing. And that frees your mind and your team's mind from this very difficult and stressful work, which is, I need to correlate an alarm from the CPU usage of my edge routers, and I correlate that with the presence of one component in another platform, but I remember that we have an exception. That permanent stress and manual correlation between different platforms is very stressful. So you avoid the difficult work, you bring a new dimension, and you secure your team in their jobs by making it even more exciting and even more close to what the company value production is.
Sure.
Great. Awesome. I think ROI to security investments is one of the key discussions in today's time. Moving on to my next question is financial organizations are now rapidly moving to digital, and there is a strict compliance brought in by the regulatory for digital transaction. So, what are the best practices to manage security for the digital transactions, especially for the financial organizations? If you can add up on that, Akshay, followed by Ellen.
Yeah, I think there is the world or the times that we're living in, where the currency is essentially actually disappearing within the country. The paper currency is disappearing in the country, and we're hoping that we should essentially get completely digital, 100% digital at least by 2030, if not earlier, within the country. I would humbly and respectfully say there are no best practices. There are mandatory practices which regulators have mandated the banking and financial segment to essentially follow. So from that standpoint, I'll give you a little view in terms of what today's at least in country regulator essentially expects. So one is that, of course, you have various levels of ways of essentially transacting. So one is like, where you use a card through various methods. Then you have the online transactions through RTGS, NEFTs, SMPS of the world. Then of course you have the SWIFT transactions for overseas payments. Then essentially you have the unified payment interface, which is an NPCI product. And I'm talking about India here. And then of course, there are other methods as well, right? Where you can essentially have various methods of paying, but obviously UPI being the underlying. Then of course you have the payment wallet method of storing your cash in your wallets, etc., digital wallets. Now, the regulators are very clear about it, and there are 2 or 3 principles that we would like to follow. Integrity of information for sure. Second is in country, in soil, on soil residency of information for all payment transactions. So when you look at any payment transaction, you would have various methods of payments, which I just spoke about. And those methods essentially will have various information in a transaction or a payment transaction, right? You will essentially have a critical information with respect to, the merchant's information. You will have the payment card network details. Then essentially you will have the personal identifiable information. You will have financial sensitive information like the card information, CVV, OTP values, etc., which will form a part of the message, the payment transaction message. And then obviously, you will have an authorization environment. Then you'll have a settlement environment, right? And then essentially you will have grievances where a transaction is challenged, and then again, you have 30 to 60 days to basically, question those grievances. And once the grievance essentially is settled, then the transaction becomes live again, and becomes live then again, within 24 hours if the transaction has been done overseas, through any of the authorization or the settlement systems for the Indian regulated entities, where the systems are residing abroad, then the transaction has to come back within 24 hours back to the country, right? That is what the regulators say in terms of on soil. Even if you look at the DR, near DR setups, they also have to be country, right? Or the transaction has to come back within 24 hours, come out. And then a copy of any of the foreign transactions have to be deleted. Even for any kind of ancillaries, right? When you have a fraud risk management system, you want to do a scoring on the transactions and those kind of things, they essentially also have to come back to the country within 24 hours. Very, very strict about it. RBI is extremely clear about it. There is no compromise to it. Then the cybersecurity posture, right? In terms of looking at, the system posture from a cyber perspective, looking at the threat scenarios, looking at active monitoring, having controls around threat monitoring, having controls about dark web analysis, in terms of looking at if there are any card informations which are being discussed in any of the dark web forums or a deep web forum. Then covering the SOP side, having the bank or a financial institute having a very well-defined, comprehensive cybersecurity SOP or a policy in place, and so on and so forth. So a lot of things essentially which are coming out from that standpoint. Now, having said that, there is another aspect of crisis management and resiliency. Very of late, Khushbu, you would have witnessed that one of the leading banks essentially had a downtime, and because of the downtime, obviously, the regulator had applied stringent fines and certain, I would say, uh, sanctions in terms of the way bank could operate till the time they don't get their act together, right? And it was all in the public forum, and it was public forum information, right? So there as well, availability is also a very, very important aspect. So from an availability standpoint is again a very important control from a security perspective. The cyber crisis resiliency, which I spoke about earlier, is also another control that today the banking and financial segment is looking at. And of late, the new law where essentially, only the regulated entities can store critical information like credit card information. So today, if you basically order food on a third-party app, that third-party app will no longer be allowed to save or store any card information, and there will be a method of tokenization which will be used between the third-party app to the bank and back. Yes, there would be slight inconvenience, but that's again for the long run benefit of the customer, because there are so many frauds and crimes which happen on the payment side of things. It is important to secure it in the best interest of the economy of the country as well. Back to you.
Great. And I'm very specific to India though, but would love to know from your point of view, what are the security measures and practices that you suggest while you've been interacting with a lot of CISOs and CIOs on this?
Yes, at the moment, the community of CISO globally is very much interested into a framework that is called zero trust access.
Yes.
Which is a way to perhaps move away from credentials that are given once for all, that once you're in, and that would work regardless to the time, and that would work regardless to the actual activity or network and network resources request that is generated at a certain point in time. Now, the former, I would say, one key fits all has lots of limitation, particularly when you grant it to a device. Because, for instance, you have this sensor that detects the density of a product, and this density is related to the speed of rotation of a centrifuge machine. So unless you reach the threshold that is your purpose, you would send an order to a middleware that will keep accelerating the engine, and the rotation speed will be increased. Now, the right to order that can be made context sensitive. And that's the main idea. I took the example of a device, but you can take the example of a user, you can take the example of a software, you can take the example of a middleware, so that at any moment, any request to access network resources is submitted to a dynamic policy engine. So the architecture of zero trust network access is that you have a device agent that resides in your PC, in your mobile phone, in the OT device. And there is, first of all, an authentication that is advisable to be at least a two-step two-factor authentication that talks to the access directory. And before you grant the access, there is a policy engine that is machine learning and artificial intelligence driven, that talks to an enforcement proxy that then grants the access requested. And that, instead of giving access once for all, you can correlate a certain number of conditions before the access to the app, to the device is granted. It's a little bit like someone steals the keys of your car and maybe the car will start. Now, you're asking the car to overspeed, and there's a policy engine that says, sorry, but you're on a road that has got 30 miles an hour of speed limitation, so I don't grant you the access to this speed, even if you have the keys of the car, sorry. And then you ask the car to take a forbidden road, and again, the policy engine can compute that. So if you're a fireman, you are granted authorization, but you can be a fireman off duty or on duty. You see, the principle is to have a dynamically granted, context-sensitive policy engine that talks to an enforcement proxy and that gives this dynamical access, which is contextual, time-sensitive, and then you have a kind of micro or identity-based segmentation. Not all the database, or the database after a certain period, for instance, when the trading activity stops, I don't see any reason why you would have access to that trade engine because you're off hours, or you've done it before, or you've never done it before. And you can detect a gap between the baseline behavioral of these credential rights and the actual. And this gap can be processed. This gap can be very quickly analyzed. It can raise a flag. It can re-micro-segment so that if it's an attack, it will be micro-located and then you can do something about it. It can warn you. It can do a lot of things once you got this intelligence. And zero trust network access is this framework, this intelligent, artificial intelligent, propelled way to go about using the network resources. And that's a big trend at the moment within the CISO community because it opens to new possibilities.
Absolutely.
Makes a lot of sense. That's right.
True. I'm sorry, with the interest of time, we've actually, I'm not sure if you both have time for me to go ahead with one or two more questions because it's already.
Yeah. Happy to take one more question, Khushbu.
Yeah, one more is okay, Khushbu, with great pleasure.
Okay, sure. You've touched upon zero trust, Alain. So I would want to, talk about the practice on managing cloud security. So I think we can cover on that. Akshay, love to get your insights.
Sure. I'll speak about some of the leading practices that we are seeing organizations adopt, and I'll request Alain, if you could touch on the architecture and the infrastructure side. So when we look at the cloud provisions, right, there are a couple of areas that you cover, right? You cover platform as a service, you cover infrastructure as a service, you cover application as a service, right? Now, generally what happens is earlier, it used to be a simple application running on the cloud. It used to be a platform being, adopted, and then you run your own applications. You used to have some shared IDs through a SaaS platform on the cloud, and then essentially, avail the services essentially that used to happen. Now, cloud has seen a paradigm shift in that. The cloud has actually become more intelligent. It has become business resilient. And it basically is absolutely mobile, in touch with your business need, right? So, bringing in on the processes, bringing in on value-added services on top of the cloud, making sure that the cloud is adaptive enough to the environment. So, for example, if an organization is very, very heavy in development and extremely heavy in going to production on their minor and major releases, how does the cloud actually work seamlessly with an organization, right? So, for example, the moment I have I have a secure DevOps environment, and that environment basically I port my code for moving from UAT to production. How does the cloud actually adapt itself by giving you security services at runtime, right? That could be one of the ways of looking at it. Just an example of what services cloud service providers are providing. Certain cloud service providers essentially are so adaptable that they provide you with all the value-added services like advanced persistent threats, data leakage prevention, information rights management, all of those, and then they basically help you adapt in terms of not only handling the infrastructure side of things from a security perspective, but also go right up to the data and the application layer. Now, what is really important for organizations to do when they go with the cloud strategy? So one is to basically define a well-defined framework from a cloud perspective, and that what that means is, it's not only about looking at cloud from a third-party perspective, but actually looking at cloud from an extended enterprise perspective. And that means that essentially having a framework with the right levels of legal agreements in place. When you sign up with an SLA and you have a third party who processes your information, make sure that those SLAs are extended right up to your third party. Also look into, when you're into your client's business, right, or you're into client service business, there are various clauses which are signed up with the clients, but you may not have everything in your control, and you will also essentially have a cloud service provider. So how do you make sure that you put the skin in the game of the cloud service provider as well, and do a back-to-back from that? Then coming to the process side of things, again, cloud provisioning, deprovisioning are also very important aspects. Say, for example, if there are various departments and each department wants to go to the cloud, then they take approval from the central team, and then they essentially ask for certain lease of the cloud environment. Now that lease essentially could be a short-term lease or a permanent lease. Now short-term lease could be a 2 to 3 month or a 4-month lease, where essentially you will have my application or an infrastructure or a platform being outsourced, and then that lease could be for various purposes. It could be for doing a UAT testing to actually going into production. So from that standpoint, there are proper security checks and balances which need to be cleared before the lease is granted. So from that perspective, again, what are the checks and balances one really maintains, and based on those checks and balances, who is basically applying the third eye to kind of give the assurance that before the lease has been acquired, it is security cleared, right? These are some of the processes which are very important, and building a well-defined framework will help you kind of provision, deprovision. And then again, if when you deprovision, how are you maintaining data residency? How are you making sure that, while the right to forget is still not there in the country, how are you making sure that the last mile, right up to the last mile, your data is deleted and confidentiality is maintained, right? These are some of the aspects just wanted to touch upon based on the, Khushbu, you've already told us we have limited time in hand. So I thought I'll just give a perspective on the process side, the framework side, and the provisioning, deprovisioning side. I'll pass it on to Alain to talk about the architecture of the security and any other area that he would like to speak on.
Thank you, Akshay, and brilliant, by the way. Very good perspective. With the little time we have left, I would perhaps keep it to the essentials and remind first that the cloud is perhaps the biggest IT trend that we have ever witnessed. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars of investments that are moving towards cloud services as opposed to buying equipment. So, and some people say the cloud have saved us into this pandemic. It is not the only thing that has saved it, but it was instrumental. Let's be fair. When you need an extra CPU, an extra storage, when you need to beta test an innovative applications and have metrics immediately associated to this innovation, how many people, where, when, what services, it comes all instrumented. You go to Alibaba Analytics, you go to Google Analytics, you go to Azure, and it comes all instrumented. Right. Now, as pure cybersecurity officers and pure security players at the end of the day, we are not a cloud provider. So it is not for us to say if it's good or bad, it's there, it's not going away. But it's to enable our users to get their freedom back. In other words, one of the fear you have when you embark into a cloud journey, it is, well, am I completely tied in the roadmap of a given cloud provider? If I start to store all my OT devices into this cloud platform, what happens when the data explodes or the rates raises? Am I going to lose in OPEX everything I've saved in CAPEX? You always have these fears. And do I get my data back if I need it? And that is the reason why 72% of the companies that have embarked into a cloud journey are bringing back one element of the cloud transformation inside their own data centers. And that doesn't mean at all, by the way, that the cloud is dead. Again, the cloud is around forever, right? But it does mean that at some point, for performance issues, for security issues, also for strategic issues, you may be forced to consider to repatriate in some device, or you can have a better cloud proposal from another cloud provider. And that is a very virtuous cycle. Cloud, back, multi-cloud, other cloud. But it's only virtuous if, but that is a big condition, you don't have to rethink, redesign, and redeploy your security policy as you go about getting some data from one cloud to another for good reasons, or back to some of your data center for very good reasons as well. So if your cybersecurity strategy, posture, policy servers, and implementation of the above, because it's all, the devil is in the details, right? You have to be able to implement it. All these precedence of applications, of links, all this authorization we talked about, authentication and zero trust network access, that are going to be crucial. If you have to redesign, manually redeploy them, you lose all the benefits of doing so. And then you're stuck into one given vendor roadmap. So what we provide is the ability to have across the cloud, across the physical appliances of your firewalls, of your authentication servers, of your zero trust, all the fabric, all the security fabric of your own architecture of cybersecurity, to have it across the piece, to have it transcending the variety and the diversity of the cloud. And again, you have to see how this materializes. You have to see how you get visibility throughout our platforms, so that you can trigger Alibaba, you can use Azure, you can benefit from Google Cloud Platform, you can be hosted on Oracle, you can use Adobe, but still have your visibility. Because there is one thing you never outsource, is the responsibility of the data. You can outsource the storage, the CPU, the delivery of a software as a service, but you still be responsible if your customer's data is found on the darknet. You still be liable. from a legal perspective of the reports that proves that. You have to have your data in some countries located in that same country when it concerns the protection of personal data. And you are accountable for that. You can go to jail if you don't do that. So this is the freedom we gave you back, the freedom of choice of your cloud strategy, but in the light of a unified visibility and cybersecurity policy.
Wonderful insights. Great. Awesome. I think this has been a great conversation, and I'm sure our viewers are going to get good insights out of this discussion and key takeaways. And I would like to thank once again Akshay and Alain for taking out time, joining us today, and coming on this platform to share your best practices and your experience with us.
Thank you so much, Khushbu, for moderating this very wonderfully and asking all the pointed and right questions, which are very relevant to today's times. And thank you so much. And Alain, it's always been a pleasure and an honor to share the virtual dais with you. And we all look forward to be interacting soon with each other. And I hope the audience essentially, sees this as a meaningful spend of their time for this 1 hour. Thank you.
And likewise, Akshay, it's been a great pleasure to have again this discussion with you. Thank you, Khushbu, for the wonderful moderation and very well spotted question. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.